So I wanted to talk about something that's been on my mind a little bit lately, regarding the history of North America and also Protestantism, which are in some ways very much linked because, I mean, both the US and Canada, especially the US, were founded largely by Protestants. And in the case of the US, many Protestant denominations that were persecuted at the time, some, to be honest, I think rather justifiably persecuted, like the Puritans, for instance. And yeah, the thing is, I think that there's a big parallel to be seen between the history of the settlement of North America in a physical sense and also the history of how Protestantism evolved within North America in a theological and kind of just the general development of the church. So, what I'm trying to say is, I think the history of North America can, and of Protestantism within North America, can both be defined as straying further and further from the European origins over time. And we could see this in the development of our culture because I think the initial settlements were far more European in nature, like in the architecture, in the layout, the urban planning, every aspect of it. And this is partly because of simple like time, because of when they were founded. But you can see this to this very day, like with the architecture in North America. Like the further east you go, generally speaking, the closer to the Atlantic Ocean you get, the more European the architecture looks, the more of that historic European vibe you get. And vice versa. Like as you get further and further from the Atlantic Ocean, the architecture becomes less and less European. Not just the architecture, but also the layout of the cities. I mean, to be honest, the layout of even on the East Coast is somewhat different from Europe in the sense that historic North American cities tend to have more of a grid pattern. Well, some European cities do have a grid pattern. It's less common in Europe, but nonetheless, it is more European in the sense of being, denser, less car dependent, more walkable, somewhat narrower streets, although some wide streets also, but narrower streets in many neighborhoods. And yeah, as you get further and further west, the society just becomes more and more car dependent on average. And you can see it in just the layout of pretty much every city and town. Now, obviously, there's a few exceptions here and there. New Orleans is an obvious exception, and Chicago, because they're sort of like, they're still in the eastern half, but they're more dense and more walkable than other cities at the same longitude. Yeah, longitude is east west. So yes, other cities at the same longitude. And well, to be fair, you could kind of say that Canada's a little bit different because our most historic cities are actually in the St. Lawrence Seaway corridor, like the Windsor to Quebec City corridor, as opposed to the East Coast, which never was settled to the same extent with large cities. Like none of the cities in the East Coast were ever as big in Canada as in the US. Like even Halifax to this day has like 400,000 people in the metropolitan area. So, but nonetheless, in Canada, you do see the same parallels. It's just that it's kind of like our equivalent of the Boswash corridor is slightly inland, but still in the in the eastern part of the continent, which is like basically the Windsor to Quebec City corridor, or more accurately, the Toronto to Quebec City corridor, or maybe Hamilton to Quebec City corridor, because when you get west of Toronto and Hamilton, it gets, there's some kind of historic architecture in some of the cities west of there, but yeah, definitely not like Windsor, for instance, does not feel like super historic. But nonetheless, like my point is, like putting aside the specifics, is like as you get further west in both the US and Canada, generally speaking, there's less historic architecture, uh, less dense urban planning, more car centrism, and it just gets more and more like that the further west you go, with the exception of the very the very west coast itself, like once you get to the Pacific Ocean, because you do get some semi dense, semi European style urban planning and architecture in cities like San Francisco and to a lesser extent Vancouver. But I would say where you reach peak North America in terms of like urban planning and architecture and just the general feel of the society, like the idea of like car centrism, individualism being the dominant ideology that just dominates everything. Like you feel that the most, I would say, in the mountain states and provinces, like the places like Nevada, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, Alberta. And Nevada really does feel like a libertarian paradise. Like that's kind of what Las Vegas feels like, is like the platonic form of libertarianism. Like this city where basically everything is legal and also everything is very car dependent. And yeah, I mean, basically my point is here, as North America as North American civilization expanded westward, it lost its European identity more and more. Although for some reason it regained it very slightly as they got to the coast, which is an interesting little quirk of history. But even then, I would say the West Coast feels less European than the East Coast, but more so than the Inland West. And I would say the Inland West, it's an interesting region because I would say it's by far the most naturally beautiful part of North America, but it's also the least architecturally beautiful, which is it's a very interesting contrast. Like, sure, you get occasional architectural beauty in the Inland West, like the Banff Springs Hotel, or I think it's the Many Glacier Hotel at Glacier National Park in Montana. But by and large, the Inland West is just devoid of anything resembling historic architecture. It's a very modernist, very car dependent, very sprawled type environment. And everything feels just completely centered around the car. So how does this parallel the development of Protestantism, you may ask? Well, in the same way as North American civilization kind of deviated more and more from its European roots the further west it got, and just over time, which again is like there's a parallel, but also like a literal, like literally the West was founded later. So it's like obviously it's going to be more modernist. I think it's a combination of geography plus time. But yeah, just as that happened, there's also a clear process over time of Protestantism deviating more and more from its European, aka Catholic roots. And I think we really see that occurring in North America more than anywhere else. Like the final form of Protestantism, so to speak. But yeah, the Protestantism deviating from Catholicism more and more and more until it becomes something so unrecognizable that it bears no resemblance whatsoever to its original European historic roots. And we can see that today with the advent of mega churches, non-denominationals, evangelicals, just increasingly like Protestant congregations that seem more like rock concerts than services, or more like cults than normal religious services. And you could argue over which Protestant denomination is the most extreme in this regard. Like obviously there's the non-denominationals, but there's also like Pentecostals, and there's Mormons, who I don't really consider Christian at all. But I mean, they're an offshoot of Christianity, and they literally like consider America to be like sacred soil. So that's an extreme deviation from Catholicism and just even European Protestantism. And again, as you can see, the gradual stage by stage progression of America becoming less European the further west you get, like comparing the East Coast, which is the most European, and then kind of like the Midwest / inland East. There's not really a good term for this region, but basically the regions that are in like the central time zone, or maybe the western parts of Eastern Standard Time. Basically everything west of the Appalachians, but east of the Mississippi or along the Mississippi, and the equivalent parts. Well, in Canada, again, in Canada doesn't really have an equivalent to that, but yeah. So then it's like slightly less European in that area. The Canadian equivalent would be, I don't know, because our East Coast isn't the East Coast. Our East Coast is the Toronto to Quebec City corridor. But yeah, like my point being, as you get further west, and then the further west than there, like in Kansas City or place like in Kansas City, you see a little bit of vague European-esque architecture, like small traces of it, but not very much. And then as you get further and further, there's just less and less until you get to cities like Denver. Well, actually, Denver is a tiny bit, but more like, okay, Las Vegas, Phoenix, Tucson, Calgary, Edmonton, Salt Lake City, like cities that have almost no trace of European style architecture or traditional style architecture at all. Denver actually probably has the most in the region, but it's still not very much. Or like Albuquerque, for instance, would have hardly any. Like, so my point is, just as you have that process over time with the settlement of North America, with North America itself becoming less European the further west you go, and also the further in time you get in terms of the settlement, the era of settlement. So too does Protestantism become less and less Catholic, like more deviated from its Catholic roots over time. And again, this is something that occurred predominantly within North America. So you have like the equivalent of like the East Coast of the United States would be like the early Protestant church. That would be like the Lutherans, the Anglicans, the Presbyterians, the more historic denominations, where it's like, in terms of not only the church architecture, but also some of the theology and some of the, like, for instance, in Lutheran churches, you even still see like crucifixes that have images of Christ on them, which many Protestants would consider very Catholic. And yeah, I feel like these historic denominations, they have less of like this obsession with like hating graven images, like this idea like we can't depict Christ, we can't depict the apostles. It's actually kind of Muslim almost, like this, or Jewish, like this abhorrence for graven images. Like they take it to such an extreme. Like the newer Protestant denominations. So yeah, as I've said, like the equivalent, the old school Protestant denominations would kind of be the equivalent of, yeah, East Coast United States. And those denominations did kind of flourish in the Eastern United States, I believe, at the time of settlement. But as you get further west, it's like as the metaphor continues, like as you get further into the development of Protestantism, you get these denominations that are just increasingly have no resemblance to the original Catholic Church at all. Like you start getting like the Pentecostals, the Baptists, and then you get the non-denominationals, who are probably the most extreme of all in that regard, or the Mormons. And yeah, I just think it's an interesting parallel. And there's some, like, it's not just a parallel, like it literally does go hand in hand, I think, to some extent. Like I do believe the East Coast of the US, I could be wrong on this, but I feel like the eastern regions of the US and Canada have a higher predominance of the more old school Protestant denominations, not to mention Catholicism itself. And as you get further west, you get more and more of the like new school Protestant denominations, plus non-denominationals and Mormons. I'm definitely right about the Mormons. Like they are very much a Western North America thing. But yeah, I think overall that probably is the case. I know there's the most Catholics in the Northeast, like Northeast US plus Quebec, Atlantic Canada, Ontario, and Louisiana because of the French influence there. Um, most of the Catholics in the Western US would be Hispanics, but I don't think there's very many white Catholics, like white non-Hispanic Catholics in the Western US. I could be wrong, but yeah. And also, sadly, I think one aspect of this that is quite unfortunate is that it's the old school ones in both cases that are kind of becoming abandoned. Like, it's the Northeast US where places are seeing population decline, and the West that is flourishing. Where, and in the same way, it's the old school Protestant denominations that are seeing people leaving in record numbers, while it's the non-denominationals, Mormons, and new school Protestant denominations that are holding up a bit better. Now, again, I'm not trying to say population decline is a bad thing. Like, I think, frankly, metropolitan areas like New York City or Boston could probably like afford to lose a few people. Like, they've become kind of overcrowded. But nonetheless, it does tie into my bigger point, which is that I think over time, North America has become more North American and less European. And people have been, with each passing generation, rejecting the old European identity more and more. And we see this again, like literally where people are moving to, but also, frankly, what type of Christian denominations they are flocking to. The question is, can this ever be reversed? Because I do believe that it would be a good thing for North America to re-embrace its European roots, whether in architecture, in religion, or in any other aspect, urban planning, etc. So the question is, can these trends be reversed? Maybe, maybe not, but I would like to think that hopefully one day they could be.